countenance be pleasant, but in serious matters, somewhat grave. The gestures of the body must be suited to the discourse you are upon. Reproach none for the infirmities of nature, nor delight to put them that have in mind thereof. Show not yourself glad at the misfortune of another, even if he is your enemy. So George Washington writes in his Rules of Civility in Company and Conversation, which I introduced last time, and I left you with the challenge of living out some of these for yourself. I wish we were meeting in person. I always love asking my students what their favorites were, and of course, if they tried some of them. What do we see here? What is Washington writing these for? Again, it's not so much advice to us. It's not clear that he even imagined that people would be reading these someday. He wrote them for himself. And like we said, that he was so accustomed to cultivating his own inner personal order that he really had no desire for political power outside. He had everything he could possibly want inside. And so these little maxims that he really stand out to us as a way to achieve the very kind of freedom that we aspire to. Where does freedom really come from? A Bill of Rights, a tradition of rights, or something like that? That's all good stuff. But Washington insists, and I think the great lesson for us is it comes from within. And I think I mentioned last time, it harkens back to Livy, that famous Roman historian who said that freedom is a matter of the heart, and it develops slowly. So it was with George Washington. So for all the beautiful notions of rights, the self-evident truth of human equality stated in the Declaration of Independence, at the end of the day, true freedom comes to us when we order our souls well. It has everything to do with the careful detail and attention that we pay to the way that we conduct ourselves. Did Washington overdo it a little bit? Yeah, probably. In fact, I cut out several of the ones that have to do with table etiquette. Like 18th century etiquette isn't quite so important, but still, though, it's a very useful reminder for us that don't assume that you have your freedom just because it's there, just because you inherit it, or even if it's self-evident. Freedom really is a habit of the heart, and it requires a free person or a multitude of free people to make a free society. George Washington is widely regarded as the first as the first citizen. Yeah, you could say first responsible citizen if you like. And he models that for us quite well. So I challenge you to continue studying and practicing, if you can, the Washingtonian virtues, because they really are something. Some of them are pretty hard too. The last one, though, is really moving. Labor to keep alive in your breast that little spark of celestial fire called conscience. That's something he took with him into the fray of political life and war and the presidency. Washington did not fall in with the other radicals of his day. The Sons of Liberty up in Boston, hotheads like Thomas Paine, who wrote Common Sense, who just wanted to destroy everything traditional, tear down the monarchy. He had this seething hatred of King George of England and all kings, just this massive upheaval. No, Washington was never on board with that. He was thankful to Paine for supporting the revolution when it came, but he didn't really see the revolution the same way Paine did. Washington was very clear-eyed about his opposition to the British and his desire for independence when it finally came. He wrote to his friend Brian Fairfax, for whom Fairfax, Virginia is named today, outside of DC. He said, "If I was in any doubt about the right which the Parliament of Great Britain had to tax us without our consent, I should most heartily concede with your opinion that to petition, and petition only, is the proper method to apply for relief." Fairfax insisted that we should keep petitioning, and eventually Parliament and the king will listen. Washington said, well, you can petition, and pretty soon it's clear they're not going to listen to you. Now, petitions aside, he said, I should even think it criminal to go further than this under such an idea, but none such I have. I think the Parliament of Great Britain has no more right to put their hands into my pocket without my consent, means taxes, right? Then I have to put my hands into your pocket for money. Wow, what a clear principled basis for revolution. This is nothing like what the radicals were saying, who just hated monarchy and wanted to just turn everything over. Washington was in with the revolution for a very, very crystal clear principle. Wow, what a contrast he was, and how different the revolution might have been had Washington gone the route of Thomas Paine and all of them. This is exactly why he was chosen to be commander in chief of the American forces and the Continental Army in the Revolutionary War. He said, "You know, I've often thought how much happier I should have been if instead of accepting the command under such circumstances, I had taken my musket upon my shoulders and entered the rank, just been a foot soldier instead of a commanding general, or if I could have justified the measure for posterity in my own conscience. I would have just retired to the back country and lived in a wigwam." Oh, come on, Washington. You loved it. You loved the power. You knew there was a lot of glory at stake. Well, he might have been faking it, except this is a personal letter he wrote to his friend Joseph Reed, just on the eve of the Declaration of Independence. So yeah, he really didn't want power. Power corrupted the soul of a person, and for that reason, he feared it and he loathed it, and he only accepted it begrudgingly. So George Washington took command, and what's remarkable is he had no control, right, over the appointment of inferior officers. Continental Congress very easily could have appointed completely incompetent men to serve under General Washington. Fortunately, they didn't, and most of them turned out to be quite trustworthy. Some of them turned out to be quite famous. Lieutenant Alexander Hamilton was certainly one. We'll talk more about him later. Totally loyal and dedicated to Washington, always ready to offer him his very best advice. And Washington could see the value of Hamilton's mind in all matters, military and, of course, later when it comes to money. He became Secretary of Treasury in Washington's cabinet. The Frenchman, Marquis de Lafayette, came over from France with a small contingent of French troops to help the Americans in their fight for independence. Lafayette was such a profound admirer of Washington. He, in fact, named his oldest son, George Washington Lafayette, that he thought so highly of the general and was so willing to serve under him specifically because of his unshakable and impeccable character. No doubt the same reasons that Continental Congress chose him to be the commander-in-chief. There was a lot at stake, though. Were these guys really ready to fight this kind of war? Washington thought. There's an actual enlistment poster you would have seen. Take notice, all able-bodied young men enlist and serve in General Washington's army. And they did. The state militias who'd been drilling and practicing and preparing for foreign attacks for years, who'd fought in the French and Indian War a few years before, now were called up in the cause of independence. And as the Springer book points out, they weren't all on the same page. Some of them seem to think that maybe after a significant fight, the British really will cut taxes and chill out. Some of them were just full on for total independence and the complete overhaul of the existing system. Some of them fought for their state's independence, not so much for the United States. Still, they were united in a common goal of pushing the British out. And who knew what would happen next? Washington was very, very unsure about the typical militia. To place dependence upon the militia, he said, is assuredly resting on a broken staff. There was no nationalized army. Continental Congress didn't want to do that. Instead, it was each state kind of fighting its own little war under a general direction of him. Men just dragged from the tender scenes of domestic life, of home life, unaccustomed to the din of arms, totally unacquainted with every kind of military skill, which being followed by a want of confidence in themselves, would oppose to troops regularly trained, disciplined, and appointed, superior in knowledge and in arms. This makes them timid and ready to fly from their own shadows. It was true. As inflamed as they were with notions of liberty and justice and the cause of independence, they were going up against the redcoats of the British Empire, the most powerful empire the world had ever seen, who were trained and equipped and disciplined in ways that the Americans were not. Still, as we know, the war took some surprising twists and turns. Washington really knew how to seize the advantage when it came, retreating from New York City into New Jersey and giving the British the impression that he was on the run. but they eased off in pursuit. He turned right back around, crossed the river, and hit them with a surprise attack. He would move strategically here and there and here and there, and it just seemed impossible to capture. The British, all the while, knew that just capturing Washington would bring this whole thing to an end, but they never did. And finally, it happened. In 1781, the siege of Yorktown, where General Cornwallis walked out of his tent holding his sword in both hands in front of him and walked up to a guy who he thought was George Washington. No, he's over there. Oh. And so Cornwallis walked down the line, and finally Washington was pointed out to him. Exiting his tent, the sword was handed over, and the war was over. Still, Americans remained on high alert. The militias on standby. Washington, again, just barely holding it together. And it finally happened in March of 1783, a few years later. The Newburgh Conspiracy, where a band of the commanding officers approached Washington. Sir, it seems that the Continental Congress is refusing to take care of us the way that they ought. We propose a reorganization of the army in such a way that it... Washington stares at them with that stern face that he had. Are you talking treason? Silence across the room. He called a staff meeting immediately. All the commanding officers in the front couple of rows, and he listed men in the back. And Washington rose in front of them and then did something really extraordinary. He put on his spectacles, his glasses, which you didn't do back in that day unless you were sitting in private, pulled out a piece of paper and said, "The rumor is that commanding officers wish to overthrow the authority of the Continental Congress with a military coup for the cause of liberty, for the cause of mankind. Please don't." And the fallout from this statement was tremendous. Officers crying. According to one eyewitness, one of them leapt into Washington's arms, pleading for forgiveness. It's all right, he said. Just don't let it happen again. How delicate the situation was. Finally, September 3rd of 1787, the treaty was signed, the Treaty of Paris. Now we go from citizens being nothing more than loyal subjects of the crown, recipients of their old British rights, which was a good thing. Now we go from that to total independence. Responsible citizenship foisted onto every American. We have a famous painting of the Treaty of Paris as it was signed, and here you see the American delegates, right? There's Ben Franklin, John Adams, John Jay, and a few others. Where are the British ambassadors? They refused to stay for the painting, and so the painter never got to finish. So all we get are the Americans. Still, it was done, September 3rd, 1783. My birthday, in fact. Can you believe it? And Washington found himself in a position to expect honors and power and all kinds of offices. Back in the old world, if you were a famous general who won this kind of victory for the crown, you would get a castle and a dozen horses and a seat in the House of Lords and cases of gold. What did Washington want more than anything else for his accomplishment in winning the Revolutionary War? He just wanted his farm. There it is in Mount Vernon. It's a big, nice house, but still it's relatively humble compared to a lot of other wealthy people's houses at that time. He came from old Virginia planter stock. He had married Martha Washington, and their combined estates came together to form a significant amount of wealth, but he didn't want to flaunt it. He just loved quiet life. So, given absolute power, and then he gave it up. And it would not be the last time George Washington did this. So I left you with some general questions last time.